Shalom, Bruchim Habayim, and welcome to Sheve'im Panim LaTorah, to 70 Faces of the Torah and also Sulam Yaakov. This week's Torah portion is Parashat Re'eh, which means to see. And the very beginning of the Torah portion deals with Moshe laying before the Jewish people the blessing and the curse of the Torah. I have subtitled this teaching, Mashiach Who. Very interesting subtitle. You'll find out what I mean by it as we go on through this teaching. So Parashat Re'eh is centered upon the dichotomy of the blessing and curse of the Torah. We read at the very beginning, Devarim, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 26 through 28. We see that Moshe says, Re'eh anochi noten lifnechem hayom beracha u'klala. See, I present before you today a blessing and a curse. Et ha-beracha asher tishmeu el mitzvot Adonai Elohechem asher anochi metzavechem hayom. And the blessing, that is, if you listen to the commandments, the mitzvot of Hashem your God, that I command you today. V'ha-kalala, and the curse, im lo tishmeu el mitzvot Adonai Elohechem v'srartem min haderech asher anochi metzavechem hayom lelechet acharei Elohim and regarding the curse, well, if you do not listen, and the Hebrew word im there is basically a condition, free will, bechira, choice. If you don't listen to the commandments of Hashem your God, and you stray from the path that I command you today to follow other gods, or gods of others, other powers, that you lo yedatem did not know. So we see here that Moshe is giving the people a conditional response. It's a free will choice. And we learn something from this. Our choice to observe the mitzvot of the Torah determine whether we will experience the blessing or the curse of the Torah. Now it's very interesting that when Moshe addressed the people, I want to bring this back up on the screen I had highlighted in yellow, that he used the singular re'eh instead of the plural re'eh. And there's a big difference. Now, if you consider the entire passage is rendered in the plural, he goes on to say here, lifnechem, before you, tishmeu, which is in the plural to listening, echem, which is the plural for you, like you all, addressing the entire assembly. And so it would have been grammatically accurate for Moshe to use the plural re'u instead of the singular re'eh. What's going on here? I like to delineate here to the Or HaChaim. The Or HaChaim addresses this, and he says that it appears that the intention here is that Moshe needed a compelling argument, because in this passage he is seeking to encourage the Jewish people to choose the goodness of the world on high, and at the same time is seeking to diminish in their eyes all benefits of this world. So in other words, in layman's terms, Moshe wants them to focus on the things of Hashem, not the things of the secular world. Or HaChaim then goes on to say, when one issues this type of moral instruction to others and he wishes to ensure that they consider his words credibly, the moral instructor needs to have two qualities. One is that he should be personally familiar with the goodness to be enjoyed by the soul on high. In other words, be intimately familiar with the spiritual things of the Torah, having seen it himself. And the second is that he should have already attained the benefits of this world and the possessions it offers. In other words, someone who's dabbled into the secular world receives a benefit. In this case with Moshe, we know that he was basically raised in Mitzrayim, brought up in their educational system. And so he was really a chiloni. He was someone who was secular before he experienced HaKadosh Baruch Hu at the burning bush in the wilderness. And so Moshe has these two qualities. The Or HaChaim goes on to say in the following passage, the latter quality is important because if the moral instructor is lacking that which can be acquired in this world, his words belittling those accusations will not be considered reliable by those who have attained the benefits of this world, because they will say, we do not tell someone who has not seen something to come and relate what he purports to know about it. For if only he would sample the pleasure of immanence in this world and its possessions and delights, he would not despise it and choose something else. Or Chaim goes on to say, on account of this rationalization, they will not incline their ears to accept his words. The first quality, in other words, the personal familiarity with the spiritual reward on high, is likewise important for when someone seeks to promote the goodness of Olam Haba, the world to come. His words will not be considered accurate and reliable by the natural intellect, as long as he himself is basing his words on blind faith alone, rather than on personal knowledge. For he has not seen this future world, nor does he have and know anything about it firsthand. Only when the moral instructor has attained all forms of earthly benefits and also has seen the goodness of the world on high will his dismissal of this world and promotion of the world on high be accepted. And so what we see based on the Or HaChaim's chidush or insight is we now understand why Moshe addressed the people using the singular Re'eh versus the plural Re'u when he says Re'eh Anochi. In other words, Moshe was telling the people to look at him and look at how his life was the perfect example of the blessing of the Torah. If the people wanted to experience the blessing of Hashem, or they needed to learn from the life of Moshe Rabbeinu. They needed to look at him to understand. And if not, then they would not be able to derive maximum benefit from Hashem's Torah. And so the Or HaChaim goes on from here and he says, the other intention of the statement of Re'eh Anochi means to look at me. This interpretation is based on that which the Rambam taught in Hilchot Shuvah. Every person has the ability to make himself as Moshe Rabbeinu. This is what Moshe was bringing to their attention when he told them that they should look at him. He meant that anyone who seeks to draw near to the holy service, the service of Hashem, he should look to emulate him. That is, they should measure themselves against Moshe and strive to continually grow toward his level, and not measure themselves against those on a lower level than they are. For if they do so, they will look at themselves as having accomplished very much and will be content with their achievements. So in other words, they're still going to live at a very low standard. Very, very interesting chidush from the Or HaChaim. When we learn about the mitzvot that are mentioned in this week's Torah portion, we are essentially learning how to integrate and instill these mitzvot in our lives, just as Moshe did. Among the mitzvot that we read in this week's Torah portion, we learn about the mitzvah of Maserim, of giving tithes, and also Sadaka, which is a form of giving tithes. It's a large bulk of the Torah portion to a degree because it also extends to giving to an evyon, someone who's a destitute person or a poor person. And a lot of it seems to be contingent upon the Jews entering into Eretz HaKodesh, but does it still have relevance today? It does, and we'll get to that. The topic of tithing deals specifically, and at least in this week's Torah portion, with what is known as Maser Sheni, or what is translated as the second tithe. And we find this in Devarim, Deuteronomy 14:22. Aser taser et kol tivuat zarecha hayotze hasadeh shana shana. You shall surely tithe. There's a dual emphasis on the word aser here, tithing, like double. You should surely tithe, like an emphasis. You need to make sure you tithe the entire crop of your planting, the produce of the field year by year, which means every year it needs to be done. Now I want to explain something here, and I don't have time to get into a whole discourse on the tithing system and all its details, but a lot of folks in Western society, they don't really understand how tithing works in the Bible, okay? According to the Torah, there are multiple levels of tithing. And these multiple levels of tithing were based on the 7-year Shemitah cycle, right? So, in other words, the Hebrew calendar, as you know it, throughout the year, at least when all the tribes were in the land, we had what's called the Shemitah Shabbat, the sabbatical rest of the land in the 7th year. You weren't allowed to plow, you weren't allowed to gain a harvest, you weren't allowed to any type of monetary compensation. You couldn't derive any type of fiscal benefit or anything off of the land. Your field and gates were open per se to all your fellow Israelites. And so the poor among you, the rich among you, everyone was able to receive benefit. Remission of loans took place. There was the sending forth any type of Jewish servants, maid servants, the Eved Ivri. That also took place every 7th year as well during the Shemitah year. But whenever we had the culmination of the Shmitot, up to the 50th year, that was called the Yovel, or in English we call it the Jubilee, in which there was a ancestral restoration of all land, property, etc. And so what's important to point out is that within the Hebrew calendar is that the tithing system that was implemented in the Torah was all based on the 7-year Shemitah cycle. And how many levels do we have here? Well, we have quite a few. The first one is what's called Teruma Gidulah. That's the great Truma that was given, okay? And we'll go into that in a second. The second one is called Maser Rishon. That's the first tithe, which is a tenth that came off the Teruma Gidulah, okay? And that would go to the Levites. So the first one would go to the Kohanim, and then you had to the Levites, and then you had the third, that's called Trumat Maaser. The Trumat Maaser was what the Levites took, a tenth of their tithes to give to the Kohanim. And then we had the fourth tithe, but this is called Maaser Sheni, the second tithe, and this refers to the collective tribes of Israel, okay? Because after they gave to the Kohen, they gave to the Levi, then they would bring the produce of the land and they would eat it in Yerushalayim, okay? And we'll read the passages corresponding to these. Then we have the fifth level of tithing, Maser Oni. That's the tithe that would be given to the poor, the orphan, the widow, things of that nature. An extension of Maser Oni is what's called Maaser Kesafim. That's called the money tithe, because in Torah times, like when the temple stood, you didn't technically offer banknotes like we do today. You offered grain, produce, things of that nature. Only, as we'll see as we read the scriptures coming up, if the travel was too long or the journey was maybe too hard for you in carrying and schlepping produce and grain around, could you exchange the monetary value of that, bring it to the land and purchase the respective produce or whatever and offer it, okay? So we have this in what's called Maaser Kesafim. That's the tithing with money, which would be tangible goods, gold, silver, or even banknotes that we use today. And that's something that came out of the Maaser Oni through developed time. And then from that, we have Sadaka, okay? So Sadaka is what most people know as charitable giving. And there's a complete law on Sadaka within itself in Jewish law, but that's ultimately derived from Maaser Kesafim and Maaser Oni. So we have here these different levels of tithing. So you have Achat, Shtayim, Shalosh, you have 3, Arba, Chamesh, Shesh, Sheva. So you have 7 levels of tithing, okay, that run within a Shemitah cycle of 7 years. Now, even though Maaser Kesafim is an extension of Maaser Oni, we'll see how it plays in, but these are the 7 different levels of tithing within a Shemitah cycle, okay? It's very important to know. So regarding the first one, Truma Gidulah, the great Truma, that consisted of separating a tenth of one's harvest as each respective Israelite was in their tribal territory. They took a tenth of that harvest. They would go to Yerushalayim, to the Beit HaMikdash, and they would give it to the Kohanim every single year. We see here, this is alluded to in Deuteronomy 18:4, Reshit, the very first of your grain, Diganecha, Tirshcha, your wine, your oil, okay, and also the Reshit, also the first shearing of your sheep, Titen Lo, you would give it to him, meaning to the Kohen. And so this is also where we get the animal tithes from as well. Those will all go to the Kohanim. This happened every year. So the second is, once again, Maaser Rishon. That was the tenth of the produce that remained from the Truma Gidulah, and then the owner would take a tenth of that and give it to the Levi'im or Levites. And this was a yearly obligation on the Shemitah cycle. So we see here in Numbers, Bamidbar 18:24, Ki et ma'aseh b'nei Israel, Hashem says here, for the tithe of the children of Israel, that they are to asher yahlimu la'Adonai, separate for Hashem Truma natati leLevim. They shall, as a gift to Hashem, I have given it to the Leviim, and therefore it is a nachala. It's a heritage for them. So not only did the general population give to the Kohanim, they also had to give to the Leviim as well. So at that point, you're looking at the tenth to the Kohen, the tenth to the Levi. You're at 20% basically of what Hashem blessed you with. The third tithe, as I mentioned, is Trumat Maaser. Now this was the responsibility of the Levites, that when they received the Maaser Rishon from the people, they would take a tenth of that and they would separate it and give that to the Kohanim. And this is also a yearly obligation based on the Shemitah cycle. And we find this in Bamidbar 18:26. To the Levites you shall speak, and you shall say to them, that once you accept for the children of Israel, et hamaser, the tithe asher natati lachem, that I have given them. That's also very important. God is the one who gives, which means our ability to make any type of finances in this world, the economy, comes alone from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he says, mitam, and therefore they're going to give to you, and that's a heritage. You shall raise it up as a gift to Hashem, and that's called the Trumat, because it's an elevation, a rule, like Ro Mimud. You raise it up, Hashem me'aser men hamaser, a tithe from the tithe, because essentially what they're getting is that they're going to give now, and they're going to elevate that by giving it to the Kohanim. And so from there, we enter into what this week's Torah portion calls the Maaser Sheni, the second tithe. Now, what's important about the Maaser Sheni is that this only applied during the first, the second, the fourth, and the fifth year out of the Shemitah cycle. And so the respective owners of their produce were required to separate the second tithe and then travel to Yerushalayim in those respective years out of the Shemitah cycle. And once there in Yerushalayim, they would bless Hashem for the fruit of their labor, and they would eat it right there and give praise to Hashem. And so in the event in which the owner could not transport the produce of his Maaser Sheni, maybe because he lived in the north and it was difficult traveling, weather conditions, whatever, maybe he was infirm, whatever the case may be, the owner could redeem it for basically its value and take the monetary value of the tithe Yerushalayim, where he then would purchase food and eat it there before Hashem. And that's what we find in this week's Torah portion, Deuteronomy 14:22-23. You shall tithe the entire crop of your planting, the produce of your field, year by year. And it says, you shall eat it before Hashem your God. In the place in which he'll choose the rest, the Shechina, Shemo Sham, there, and therefore you shall, the tithe of your grain, your wine, your oil, the firstborn, your cattle, your flocks, so that you will learn to revere, okay, Hashem your God all the days. So we even see here how Yirat Hashem, Yirat Hashemayim, reverence of Hashem, leads one to financial wisdom as well. And so this is the Maaser Sheni. And by the way, this is only contingent in Eretz HaKodesh, in the land of Israel. This does not apply outside of Eretz HaKodesh. Now, the next offering after this is what we call the Maaser Oni, which is the poor man's tithe. And this was only done during the third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle. And so Maaser Sheni was essentially substituted with Maaser Oni, which was distributed to the poor. And we find this in this week's Torah portion as well, Deuteronomy 14:28-29. And it says there, Miksei Shalosh Shanim, at the end of 3 years, you shall take every tithe, as kol maaser tivuatecha, of your crop, and you shall set it down inside your cities, or literally your gates. And it says, Uva HaLevi, the Levi will come, Ki ein lo, for he has no portion, right? He doesn't have a chelik of his own, no ancestral land, no nothing, the Levi and the Kohen. And therefore, that should be imach with you. And also the Hager, the ger here is a ger tzedek. Okay, there is a responsibility for Am Israel to take care of a ger toshav as well, which is a resident, like a ben Noach, right? A Noachide is what they call rabbinically. The Torah calls them a ger toshav, which means they're not legally Jewish, but they can perform certain mitzvot of the Torah that are applicable to them, but they're not bound by the Torah per se. And so the ger here is referring to the ger tzedek, the convert. And also we see here the orphan and the widow in your cities, so that they may eat and be satisfied, in order that Hashem your God will bless you in all b'chol ma'aseh yadecha, in your handiwork, asher ta'aseh, that you may undertake, and the things that you may produce, or whatever Hashem has you doing in this world. Now, the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle is what we know as Shemitah, right? And that is when all produce was rendered ownerless. It doesn't matter if you have acres and acres of land and you're producing various fruits and other vegetables. Basically, your land was ownerless. And so because everything was ownerless during Shemitah, there was no legal obligation to offer tithes. This was not required. And so we find this back in Vayikra, Leviticus 25, 1 through 7, and which is Parashat Bahar, and the Torah addresses the laws of Shemitah there. Vayidaber Adonai Moshe b'Har Sinai lemor, Hashem spoke to Moshe on Mount Sinai, saying, Deber b'nei Yisrael mata lehem ki tavo'u el ha'aretz asher ani noten lachem, that when, speak to the children of Israel, when you come into the land that I give you, the land, it says, v'shavata ha'aretz Shabbat la'Adonai, shall have a Shabbat rest for Hashem. Sheish shanim tizra sadecha, for 6 years you may sow in your field, v'sheish shanim tizmor, and for 6 years you may prune your karmecha, your vineyard, and also v'asafta et tevuata, and you may gather its crop. However, uvashana hashvi'i Shabbat Shabbaton yihei la'aretz Shabbat la'Adonai, but the 7th year shall be a complete Shabbat for the land. It's a Shabbat for Hashem. And that means that your field you shall not sow, and your vineyard you shall not prune. The Torah then goes on to say, and therefore any aftergrowth of your harvest you shall not reap, and the grapes you shall set aside for yourself, and you shall not pick. It shall be a year of rest. Now when it says not pick, that's referring to any monetary value of the produce you grow, right? So you can't attempt to sell it, not even what's called one pruta or a penny. It's a complete year of rest, the Torah says. And therefore the Shabbat produce of the land shall be yours to eat, for you, for your servant, also for your maidservant, and also for your laborer, and for your ger toshav who dwells among you. So here we're talking about the resident as well, the ger toshav resident. And so for your animal and for the beast that is in your land, all of its crops to be eaten. Now, what makes sense here about a laborer or anyone, these are hired, possibly non-Jewish servants, whether it's a shifcha, an eved, etc., because normally an eved ivri, a Jewish servant, is required to go free, unless, as this is a Parashat Mishpatim, he lo choshi, I don't want to be sent free, and so you have to pierce his ear with a marseya out the doorpost for being a fool, a kasil, for rejecting freedom from Hashem. And so anybody who qualifies as a servant here, whether it's a Kanani, a Canaanite servant, a shifcha, male, female, doesn't matter, Eved Ivri doesn't want to go free, or a ger toshav, everyone who's dwelling in Eretz HaKodesh, because gerim toshavim are permitted to dwell in Israel every yovel. That was the rule of thumb, in which Noachites could actually dwell in Eretz Israel, and Israel had to look out for their welfare, sustain them, make sure they were protected from enemies or vindictive family members who may want to kill them for giving their allegiance over to the Jewish people and the God of Israel. So we see here is that this is Shemitah. Everything lays fallow. Nobody used to sell anything. Everyone's to receive maximum benefit. And also there's a remission of certain things as well. Loans, debts, etc. And all this would basically consummate all the way until we got to, we know, as the Yovel. Now, an extension of the Maaser Oni, as I was mentioning before, is what we call Maaser Kasafim, which is the tithe, the money tithe, right? And that's actually considered a form of Sadaka. They're all kind of tied together, but separate to a certain degree. The laws of Maaser Oni actually have little relevance in today's world. Why is that? Well, for one, we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, so the laws of offering produce to a Kohen, to a Levi, the way it was done, we don't do today, because we don't know technically who is who, right? We don't have any accurate ancestral records, especially amongst people who say that their last name is Khan, Levi, Cohen. Nobody can actually legitimately prove that they are a descendant of Aharon. But nonetheless, we don't have a system in place. So a lot of these laws are not applicable, even though there are some Jewish farmers in the land that do take it upon themselves to observe the Shemitah year. They won't grow anything in the land. There is that on a volunteer level, but it's not mandatory across all Eretz Israel, and definitely does not apply outside, in Chutz Haaretz, outside the land of Israel. So when it comes to the laws of Maser Oni, the reason why they have little relevance today is for one, produce grown outside of Israel does not require separation of tithes. And within Israel, I'm going to call it something about even the modern day state of Israel, many people purchase their produce from supermarkets in which, if there has been a Maser already performed, it was either separated by the farmer who was observant or maybe the store owner who was observant. And so the custom of giving to the poor in today's world becomes known as what's called Maser Kesafim, which is tithing via money. And according to many rabbinic authorities, Maser Kesafim is considered an aspect of Sadaka. Now, while there is no scriptural command of Maser Kesafim, Chazal taught that the word kol, and when the Torah says, aser ta'aser et kol, you shall surely tithe kol tivuat za'echa, the entire produce, everything that you sold in and that you reap benefit, the entire thing you have to tithe on. Chazal says that the word kol there teaches that we are obligated to not only separate tithes from produce, assuming that we're farmers or landowners producing crops, but also that we are required to separate tithes from any profit we make. Whether you work on Wall Street, whether you work in the engineering department at Tesla, whether you basically are working at a grocery retail store, whatever the case may be where you make your kesef from, you're also required to tithe on that, where you get the tenths from. In fact, we find this concept alluded in the Piska here, the Piska de Rav Kahana. It says on Deuteronomy 14:22, Aser ta'aser, you shall surely tithe the entire crop. That is, tithe, that you may never be in want. In other words, never be in poverty. Tithe, that you may be prosperous, and which the Holy One, blessed be He, is saying in this verse, tithe, that which is mine, essentially comes from me, and I will make you prosper by prospering what is yours. And then goes on to say afterwards, the words tithe all, kol here, according to Rav Abba Bar Kahana, are a remez. It's an allusion to merchants and seafarers, that they are to set aside a tithe of their income from men who labor in the Torah. So in other words, in those days when most people made their living, whether it's in the fishing industry or whatever, exports off the Mediterranean, they would bring in a tithe from that money and they would donate it to Talmud Torah, to learning of Torah. And it's still done today as well, okay, just in a different economic sector, but that concept still remains the same. And then finally, the Midrash goes on to say, if you merit such reward by tithing, you will continue to go forth to sow in your field. In other words, Hashem will make sure you have always enough income coming in to prosper you so you can continue on your future endeavors and the visions He gives you. However, if you do not merit it, if you're not zocheh, it says, then the hunter who is notorious for going forth into the field will in the end wage war against you. And who is that? Ze Esav HaRasha, that is the wicked Esav, of whom it is written in Breshit 25:27, that he's Ish Yodeh Sa'id Ish Sadeh. Esav was a cunning hunter, a man of the field, an expert in business affairs. In other words, the Midrash uses Esav as a metaphor for the heavily prosecutor of the Satan, and which will bring accusations against people for not upholding their commitment to the Torah. And therefore, when Hashem prospers them in their finances, what Hashem is going to do is send some type of unseen event via the Satan to bring obstruction, in which they start to basically develop holes in their pockets, and their money is running out fast, and they start running into economic hardships. Hope people are listening to that, especially in light of what we experience in today's world with all the inflation and the other things that are going on. And they're concerned about a economy here, a economy there. The Torah has its own economy, and if you follow it, you'll be 100% successful. And so Esav, we know, was someone who was prosperous and everything. But the Torah's language of the field meant he was very smart. He was a businessman. He understood the transactions of the secular world, which is sadly why he basically was overtaken by the Yetzer Hara. And he went to the Sitra Achra, the dark side. And therefore, this is why this world, as we're going to see as we go through the writings of Chazal, is known as the Klipa of Esav. It's the kingdom of Rome, okay? It's not just referring to the old empire of Rome, but it's referring to a system, okay, a state of mind. And so we see here the Midrash mentions that if a person's not cognizant and careful in doing their tithes to Hashem, then Hashem sends a destroyer to them. Now, when the Torah speaks about the mitzvah of basically tithing in this week's Torah portion, we see that there's an emphasis about giving among the poor of Israel. And this is an important passage we read here, Deuteronomy 15, 7 through 8. And keep in mind, the Torah has already talked about Maser Sheni and everything else, but yet the Torah goes on to put an added emphasis about the poor. We read here, Ki Yehezqel Itaqli me'achad achecha be'achad she'arecha. If there shall be a destitute person, an evyon, among you. Also, you can literally say, in you. That's very interesting, in you. We'll see what that means. Any of your brothers in any of your cities or your gates, that's another important word, she'arecha, keep that in mind. It says, be'artzecha, in your land, asher Adonai Elohecha noten lach, that Hashem your God gives you, you shall lo ta'amet et levavecha, not harden your heart, velo, you shall tikpot, not harden your heart or close your hand, et yadecha me'achicha, against your destitute ha'evyon brother. Rather, ki patoach tiftach, there's a dual emphasis here, you must surely open your hand, and you shall lend him his requirement, whatever is lacking. Of course, you don't do interest, etc., but you have an obligation to give, whatever is lacking. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is important when the Torah mentions this, I mentioned earlier that tithes were given based on the Shemitah cycle. You had a full 6 years to give to various things. Truma Girolah, Maser Rishon. If you were Levi, you gave your tithes. Maser Sheni, Maser Oni. Offering Sadaka, excuse me, which is considered an extension of tithing, which is an extension of Maser Kesafim, okay? And Maser Oni was done during the third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle. But here in this passage, when the Torah speaks on the mitzvah of Sadaka, it's based on giving outside of the Shemitah cycle. What do I mean outside? Well, the Torah warns us that we are obligated to give Sadaka even if the coming year of the Shemitah cycle is Shemitah, meaning that we're all inside Shemitah, the land is fallow, we're not producing anything, we still have an obligation to give. We're not deriving benefit from it, but we have an obligation to give. We have to go the extra mile. And this is very interesting. Why should we give if all Klal Israel is being sustained from the land for free? If everybody's equal, in other words, there's no classification of rich and poor right now, there's remission of loans and debt. Why am I required to give? What's going on here? There's something extra here. Torah goes on to say in the following passage, beware lest there be a lawless thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year approaches, Shemitah approaches. It's also the remission year when people's credit card debts and everything are completely wiped out. And you will look malevolently upon your destitute brother and refuse to give him. Then he may appeal against you to Hashem, and it will be considered a sin upon you. This is where the heavenly prosecutor gets involved. Torah then goes on to say, Naton titain, we see this dual emphasis, you shall surely give lo to him. And you let your heart not feel bad when you give to him. In other words, don't feel like you're going to lose out here, like you're dipping into your income or something, the Torah is saying. Why? For in return, hadavar hazeh, this matter, Yivarecha Adonai Elohecha, Hashem your God will bless you bechol ma'asecha, in all of your deeds. Uchol mishlach yadecha, and everything that you put your hand to. Talk about the golden Midas touch. This is 100% guarantee for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is where we find tithe, never to be in want. Tithe, and you'll never go in poverty, because this is a guarantee from Hashem. And so what we learn from this passage is that every Jew is obligated to tithe based on the Shemitah cycle. They're required to give Truma Gidulah, Maser Rishim, Maser Rishon, Maser Sheni, Maser Oni, etc. And if they're a Levite, they have to give their tithes. When the Torah speaks about giving Sadaka to an Evyon, it's speaking about somebody who's in dire, dire need. This is a person who's in dire need. Yeah, their sins or their sins, their debts are in remission. They're living for free basically for the year, but there's something else going on here. They're in more need. And so the Torah warns us not to think that just because a person's debts are being erased during Shemitah and everyone lives off the produce of the land for free, that individuals are exempt from helping their fellow Jew. No. Once again, while there is no halachic requirement to offer tithes during the Shemitah year, the Torah promises that if we give to our fellow man in need, Hashem is going to repay us. That's a guarantee. Deuteronomy 15:10, which I just read there, you shall surely give, and let your heart not feel bad when you give to him. For in return for this matter, Hashem your God will bless you in all your deeds and in your every undertaking. Uchol mishlach yadecha. Mishlach is what you send, like sending out. Yadecha, your hand. It's like a colloquial term here, that whatever thing that your project you're involved in, Hashem's going to make sure you have hatzlacha, great success. An important feature to point out regarding offering a tzedakah as a form of tithes is that tzedakah is not just limited to giving to the literal poor, but it's to any Jew in need to fulfill the will of Hashem. This is very important, because a lot of people think, oh, it talks about the poor, but what defines poor? This is very important. So we'll look here to the Sefer HaChinuch, and commenting on Sadaka, which is mitzvah 479 out of the 613 mitzvot, the Sefer HaChinuch says, and he wrote this to address his son, whether that was mamash, his literal son, or just a talmid with a disciple, ve'ata b'ni, and now my son. Do not think, excuse the typo there, that the mitzvah of Sadaka applies only regarding a poor person who has no bread or a garment. It is not so. For the mitzvah of Sadaka can sometimes be fulfilled even with the very wealthy. He goes on to say, for example, it can be fulfilled with a wealthy person who is in a place where no one knows him, and having spent his money, he needs a loan. Not a load, but a loan. Excuse me, I was typing this super fast, so I may have various typos. If you can lend him the money, you are obligated to do so, and this is considered tzedakah. Now notice here, if you can, because not everyone can, but for those who can, you have an obligation, halachically, to do so. HaChinuch says, undoubtedly, this too is included in the mitzvah tzedakah, since the Torah always favors acts of kindness, and as such, when it commands us to give tzedakah to the poor, it surely means that we should fulfill the wants of all Hashem's creations, who are members of his covenant. And any way we can achieve this, it makes no difference whether the person in need is poor or otherwise wealthy. And the mitzvah includes all forms of assistance. Then he goes on to conclude and says, the general rule of the matter is that anyone who benefits his fellow, whether by providing him with money or with food or with any other needs, or even with kind and comforting words, all this is included in the mitzvah of Sadaka. And one's reward for performing any of these acts of kindness is very great. That's very, very powerful what the Sefer HaChinuch is saying, because sometimes just by volunteering your time, maybe at a retirement center or going to visit someone in a prison, right? Or going out to help the homeless, using your time, maybe even making sandwiches, that's considered tzedakah. Because you may not be saying, well, I don't have extra kesef sitting around in the bank, but I have this talent. Maybe you go to a retirement center where people are, they're there, and you're like a pianist. You have the skill to play a piano. You can play a piano for people. In other words, what Sefer Chinuch is saying is that tzedakah comes in various forms. Don't think it's just one in a category of people. We all have an obligation. And yes, even if someone's very wealthy, or they may be financially well off better than you, but they want to basically start out on a project. They have a vision to build a yeshiva or a hospital or whatever, a girls' school or a pregnancy care center, whatever the case may be. Says, hey, you need to help this individual. Give a tithe to them. Help them. You have an obligation. This is Am Israel. Kol Israel Arvim Zeh Lazeh. Everyone's in together on this. Now, one of the things that we find through these verses is this emphasis to give tzedakah. It's a dual emphasis, and I'll go back through it as I was mentioning as we were reading the verses. Deuteronomy 15:10. Naton titen, surely give. 10, giving, constantly. There's a dual emphasis here. We back up 2 verses. Verse 8, Ki patoach tiftach. Patach, open. You should surely open your hand. And of course, there's some Mefarshim commentaries on this that say, if you open your hand, Hashem opens his hand to you. This reminds us of what it says in Psalm 145, that Hashem basically gives Shifa. We ask God to open his hand for us. And then we go on over here to the beginning of Deuteronomy 14:22. Aser ta aser. Aser is being repeated here. You shall surely tithe. And so in these 3 different verses, we find a dual emphasis. The dual emphasis of giving is really identical to the command of tithing, the Maser Sheni. That's what it is. And that's why many of the commentaries on the passage in Deuteronomy there will say, tithe so you'll never be in poverty. Now, what's interesting about these passages and how it relates to what I subtitled for this teaching, Mashiach Who, and that's with a question mark. According to Chazal, the Geulah, the redemption, will come because of the mitzvah of Sadaka. That's how the Geulah, the redemption, is going to take place. We go back here to the Sefer Chinuch commenting on this. He says, V'amiru zichrodam livracha. The sages have taught. And this is brought down in the Midrash of the Tananim. I know it says in brackets there, Shemot Rabbah. I didn't find it in Shemot Rabbah, but I know it's mentioned in the Midrash of Tananim, She'ein Shum Adam. Therefore, no person ever comes to experience poverty, la'aniyut le'olam. Okay, due to what? An abundance of giving tzedakah. Right there's a guarantee. No one has ever gone poor by giving tzedakah. All right, and that's from Midrash Tananim that he's quoting from right there. And he goes on to say afterwards, Shnei Amar, the prophet Isaiah 32:17, goes on to say, the product of tzedakah shall be peace. Shnei Amar v'chaya ma'aseh hasadaka shalom. Shall be peace. Chazal also taught that Israel will be redeemed in the merit of tzedakah, according for Shabbat 139a. And therefore the prophet also said in Isaiah 127, Sion mishpat tipatei v'shavecha v'sadaka. Sion, Zion, will be redeemed through justice, and those who return to her through tzedakah. Interesting. So it's the mitzvah of tzedakah that's going to secure the Geulah. Now the idea that redemption can take place by offering a tzedakah is approached in this week's Torah portion by the Or HaChaim in a very interesting way in his commentary that I would like to share with you guys here today. Now when the Torah speaks about giving to an evyon, it uses interesting language because it says it's a evyon me'achad and achecha be'achad she'arecha. It's one of our brothers, one, that's the language, achad, of our brothers, who is also achad she'arecha, in our gates. Interesting, peculiar language if you ask me. And so we'll delineate here to the Or HaChaim, who's going to open us up to a unique expanse of Mashiach Who, which is why I subtitled this. Excuse me. And he goes on to say here to Deuteronomy 15:7. He says this verse is a remez, it's an illusion, regarding one and singular person in our nation, for whom we hope and wait, longing for the day when he will arrive. Namely, who is that? V'hu melech Israel. That's the king of Israel, Mashiach, our Messiah, who is referred to here as Evyon, as a destitute person. Indeed, we find that according to Chazal, Mashiach is likened to being poor. It means he's on Section 8 welfare. Is he a part of the hyperinflation that America and the world is experiencing? Not really. However, they said there in Masechet Sanhedrin 98a to the verse in Zechariah 9:9 that Mashiach is what? Mashiach is a oni. He is a poor individual who is riding on top of a chamor, a donkey. Now, I want to explain something here on this passage without going too much off of the path and focus on this shiur, the topic here. But the passage in Masechet Sanhedrin, and I'm going to be addressing that in great detail here as well, and dismissing a lot of misunderstanding about messianic concepts of the Mashiach, especially in the writings of Chazal, specifically the Masechet of Sanhedrin is being quoted from here, that people take out of context. The notion of Mashiach being poor, riding on a donkey, contextually deals with Chazal debating whether Israel is zoche or not zoche, whether they're worthy or they merit the coming of the Messiah or not. And if they are worthy, the notion is that he will come upon the Ani HaKavod, the clouds of glory. And most people read that and they think for some reason that there's going to be an individual coming out the sky, similar to the way Christianity perceives the coming of Yeshua HaNotzri, or Jesus. And the thing is with that is that that's not accurate whatsoever. The Ani HaKavod is a metaphor for the Shekhinah, meaning Israel, if they are worthy, okay, if they merited such a coming, messianic consciousness is going to come at a time where Israel's consciousness is elevated, okay? They are all in one accord. And therefore they merit a completely different ushering in of Hashem's kingdom, a restoration of the kingdom of Israel on a different level. That's what that's alluding to, similar to how the Jews basked under the rays of the Shekhinah in the wilderness. However, if they're not worthy, then the other option is Mashiach comes in a generation poor, riding a donkey. And I explained this many, many times before, but for those who have not heard it, the Hebrew word chamor is from the Hebrew word chomer. And chomer is coarse physical nature. It's also what you use to make up mortar and clay and brick building. Okay? So, spiritually speaking, chomer refers to just base materialism. Okay? Which is what most of humans focus on today. It's something that's the opposite, the antithesis of spirituality. A chamor, related to chomer, is that back in the day, a chamor, a donkey, it's not just an ignorant behemoth, a beast, an animal, right? Which also, basically is a perfect stereotype for man who is based in materialism, because they lack spiritual sensitivity. That we see here is that the chamor, the donkey, was used to schlep your belongings. It was the ancient version of a pickup truck, right? It would carry your goods from point A to point B if you were involved in projects, and that's how you depended upon making kesef, money. And so really what Chazal is saying is that Mashiach is, if Israel's not worthy, then the Mashiach comes in a generation that's steeped in materialism. They're like a chamor. They are spiritually ignorant. They're ignoramuses. They're not sensitive, privy to understanding what's happening spiritually. Oni, that describes an impoverished person, not just literal poverty. You could be very wealthy like Jeff Bezos. I mean, he's a wealthy Jew. But guess what? Spiritually, he's impoverished. And there's many like that. And so that's a whole generation that they don't realize it. And so the concept of Mashiach, and don't think that it's an individual schlepping in on a donkey. It's a description. It's a state of consciousness. That's what this is alluding to here, okay? Like, I'll be dispelling many of these so-called misunderstandings of Chazal as we go through this teaching. So the Or HaChaim goes on to say afterwards, he says, our verse thus alludes to the factor that causes Mashiach to be destitute by saying among you or through you, also, becha means in you, meaning because of you, for indeed it is our transgressions that have prolonged the duration of exile, the Edom, the Edomite exile, the Roman exile that we have been in, even though there's a Medinat Israel, a state of Israel, that means nothing. It's based on democracy and other liberal ideologies and whatever, right? There's a massive dichotomy in Israel. And so what we see here is that there's not a true Geulah taking place right now. The potential's there, no doubt about it. And therefore in you, because why? This is happening within. All this is internal, it's states of conscience. And so he says that this verse also is a remez, as the term becha, which may be interpreted as with regard to you, meaning that Mashiach is destitute regarding us, for he longs for the day when he will come to redeem us. Then he goes on to say, you may learn this from Chazal, who taught relating the incident of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi when he ascended to Gat Eden, and when King Mashiach saw him, he questioned him about the Jewish people, asking what they are doing in the world. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi answered him that they are sitting and awaiting his arrival. When the pious Mashiach heard this, he broke out in great crying due to his intense desire to come and redeem them. It goes on to say, the verse says, Mashiach is a Evyon, in one, a destitute one in our gates, be'acha she'arecha. Well, according to the Sefer Zohar, this means if one community or one assembly will be aroused to do shuvah, Mashiach ben David will arrive immediately. Now keep on this passage, keep in note, a mental note, she'arecha, the gate, because this also alludes to the gate of Rome, which I will talk about later on. And so the Or HaChaim then goes on to say, by saying that we should not harden our heart, or we should we should not close our hand, or harden our hearts, or close our hand, excuse me, I'm reading that backwards here, or close our hand. Hashem is instructing every Jew not to harden their heart against Mashiach. Rather, they shall strengthen themselves with all their might and power that they possess to do everything they can to fulfill the longing of the one and only Mashiach, for Mashiach's arrival will occur only by means of the good deeds performed by people, and particularly through the mitzvah Sadaka, as it's written in regard to Yerushalayim from Isaiah 54, verse 14, that you shall be established through the Sadaka, through Sadaka, the Or HaChaim says. Then he goes on to conclude. The verse then concludes by saying, against your destitute brother, which may be interpreted to mean, on account of your brother, the destitute one, the well-known destitute one. In other words, it's singular now, one individual, ha'evyon. There's a definite article, hey, which is an allusion to who the Varzeh shel Mashiach, okay, or, excuse me, it means to the Mashiach. This means that a person shall consider in his mind that the good deed that he performs is for the purpose of this matter, the varzeh, this matter. I jumped ahead in reading the Hebrew. And therefore, look what he says, to hasten the arrival of the anointed one, Shel Mashiach Hashem Shemo Chaim, the anointed one of Hashem, whose name is Chaim. Now, I can also tell you right now, in Hebrew, when it says that Shemo Chaim, his name is Chaim, the Or HaChaim is alluding to his name. That he's saying that the Mashiach is his name, which can also be interpreted to say that he's saying that he's Mashiach, which is not to be taken literal, because most people don't really even understand the role of Mashiach. There's a lot of developed ideas mystically that you get from Kabbalah. These are developed, but you have to understand literally the Mashiach, if you want to understand in the literal notion of it, was basically the king of Israel. That's really what the installment of Mashiach was. If you want to get into nuances about semantics of the Mashach, the root of Mashiach, means anointed. It first appears with Aharon, the Kohen Hagadol. But anything else that developed after the temple is destroyed, that's not halachic, it's optional to believe in. And so we find a very, very interesting chirush, perush here from the Or HaChaim, dealing with the topic of redemption coming through Sadaka, that ultimately leads to the coming of Mashiach, and that he even goes off to say here that the Mashiach's name is Chaim, which is allusion to his name. I mean, what's going on here? I mean, and how is, tithing the secret to redemption? I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of very, very lucrative Jewish people out there who donate, who give Sadaka, right, to different causes. I mean, what does this really mean? Okay? Now, over in Masechet Pesachim, Chazal taught that the name of Mashiach was created before creation. So here goes one of these mystical agadot that we find in the Talmud that people run with left and right and they don't know what they're talking about. But let's talk about it. It says over here, Shiva Devarin Nivreu Kodem. 7 things were created, and it's referring to the spiritual worlds. All right? But really before the physical world was created, Shenivra Haolam. And what are they? Ve'eluhein. They are Torah, okay? Teshuvah, okay? Ve'gad Eden, which is paradise, or some people call heaven. Ve'gehinom, Gehinom, Gehinnom, hell. Ve'chisei HaKavod, the throne of glory. Uvet HaMikdash, the temple. And Ushmo Shel Mashiach. In the name of the Messiah. Now you got to understand something. When Chazal teach that the name of Mashiach predates creation, they are teaching how the letters of Mashiach's name are channels for bringing his influence from his source in the spiritual world to the earth. That's what they're alluding to here. They're not saying that there is a pre-existent name or anything like that. They're alluding here to a mystical concept about the letters of Mashiach, which are attached to the higher sources of Hashem in the upper worlds that bring all the influence and energy to the lower world. Now, when we talk about the name or names of Mashiach, Shemot Mashiach, there is a very interesting Gemara that appears over Masechah Sanhedrin that says that Mashiach has a couple names. His name is Shiloh, Yinun, Chanina, Menachem, or even Chivra, which is a Metzora in Aramaic. So we see here in Sanhedrin 98b. Question is asked over here, Ma Shemo, what is his name? Meaning the name of Mashiach. And so afterwards it says, Rav Shila says, his name is Shiloh. As it says over here in Brishit, Genesis 49, verse 10, that when Yaakov blessed Yehuda, he basically says that until Shiloh comes. Rav Yanai says, no. His name is Yinon, as it says in Tehillim 72:17, that may his name endure, Yehi Shemo Leolam Lifnei Shemesh Yinon, forever, for as long as the sun may continue. And Yinon is being translated as continue, which doesn't make sense because there's no English equivalent, and I'll talk about that shortly. Anyway, not last but least, Rav Chanina then comes along, and Rav Chanina says, Chanina is his name. What do you mean, Chanina? Shnei Amars, this is in Jeremiah 36, verse 13. It says afterwards here, Asher lo iten lachem Chanina, for I will give you mercy. Okay, which is the 2-letter root, Chenun. Okay, Chen means grace, which is also an inversion of the name Noach, by the way. I'll give you mercy, I'll give you grace. That's essentially what it says over here. So the Gemara then goes on to say, Menachem. Some say it's Menachem Chezkiyahu, which is also a play in the word Chizuch, Chazach, which is also Yehezqel comes from, which means strength. Menachem means comforter. Because why? It says in Echa, Lamentations 1:16, it mentions that Ki rachach mimeni menachem, Mashiv, a comforter to receive my spirit is far from me. This obviously refers after the calamity and the aftermath of the Chorban Chabai, the destruction of the first temple that Jeremiah tragically lived through and recorded to see. And also the rabbis say, they come along with Rabbanan Amri. What do they say? They say, hey, listen, Mashiach's name is Chavira, okay, Chivra, or in Hebrew it would be Metzora, okay, and he's from the house of Rebbe, which is Rav Yehuda Hanasi. As it states, quoting from Isaiah 53, verse 4, indeed, it was our diseases that he bore and our pains that he endured, whereas we considered him plagued, he was smitten by God and afflicted. So it's the famous Isaiah 53 passage that has been, hostilely debated or, debated between, obviously Judaism and Christianity. Even though contextually refers to Israel, there's plenty of rabbinical passages that say alludes to Mashiach as well, especially the Zohar, but you gotta put it in context, kids. That's what it's about. So it's a very interesting passage. Now, what I want to point out here, for those who don't know, who may be familiar with this passage in the Gemara, is that we find the same account about the name of Mashiach also in the Midrash. But over there, the name of Mashiach is expounded since it's related to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. It appears in Echad Rabbah, the lamentation, the Midrash of Lamentations. And so in Sefer Echad, when Yirmiyahu records about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, he speaks about the Jewish people crying for a comforter to restore their soul. And so that passage is what we just saw the Gemara quote, but in its totality, it says over there, over these do I cry. And my eye runs continuously with water because a what? A ki rachach many menachem meshiv nafshi, a comforter to restore my soul is far from me. And therefore my children have become forlorn because the enemy has prevailed. And so this is Yirmiyahu describing how Yerushalayim feels and the onslaught and destruction of Nebuchadnezzar and the exile that took place. But we see here a comforter is what Israel desires. So the Midrash comes along to this passage in Echad Rabbah 151. And the question is asks what it says Mashiach Sanhedrin, Mashemo, Shel Melech HaMashiach. What is the name of King Mashiach? And it says over here, Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says, Hashem Shemo, his name is Hashem. Well, he's getting really Christian on us here, right? No problem. What's that mean, though? It says because in Jeremiah 23:6, Shnei Amar v'zeh Shemo asher yichra'u Hashem sekenu, that Hashem is our righteousness. Rabbi Levi comes along and he says that its name, and this refers contextually to the city of Sion, Jerusalem, Har Habayit, is supposed to be called Hashem Sekenu. So it's referring to that. And so Rav Levi says, well, its name, meaning Yerushalayim, should be like the name of its king. And the name of its king should be like the name of its God. So in other words, Yerushalayim reflects King Mashiach reflects Hashem. And you can find this whole topic talked about over in Bava Batra 35b. I left that there in brackets. And so it says, it is beneficial for a province that its name be like the name of its king. For it is also written in Ezekiel 48:35, and the name of the city from the day shall be called Hashem Shama. Hashem Shama, which means Hashem is there. And the name of his king should be like the name of his God. For it's also stated regarding Mashiach in Jeremiah 23, verse 6. Hashem is our righteousness. That's what that means. Well, the Midrash goes on to say, afterwards, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, he says, listen, Amar Semach Shemo, his name is going to be Semach, Shnei Amar, as it says over here in Zechariah 6:12. It says, Hine ish Semach Shemo, and it mentions there his name is Semach, for he shall flourish in his place, and he will also build the sanctuary of Hashem. Rav Yudin said in the name of Rav Ivu, his name is Menachem. For it also says there, quoting for Echad 1:6, that because Ki rachach mimeni, it says a comforter to restore my soul is far from me. And then Rav Chanina says, which is also, he says the name of Mashiach is like his name, for chen, for grace. He says, well, let's not argue here about Semach and Menachem being the name of Mashiach. Why is that? Because the gematria of Semach, 138, is the same gematria or numerical value of the name Menachem, which is also 138. Now, the Midrash, at this point, it continues by incorporating a story that we actually find in Masechet Brachot in Yerushalayim, or the Jerusalem Talmud, about the revelation of Mashiach being born out of the Chorban Chabayit, the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av. And so it's a story and incorporates there. And from there, the Midrash continues with the names of Mashiach by adding what we just read from Masechet Sanhedrin 98b and incorporates those names. However, the Midrash then contains an alternative view in which it adds other names, and I'm going to add that here. But if you want to go take a look at it in its totality, feel free to read this passage from Echad Rabbah 151. And so the Midrash will pick up here, and it says afterwards, it says Rabbi Beva, and it says he comes along, and he's from a place called Sageroya, or Sanegoria, which is not supposed to be a place. They say it's maybe refers to him being blind. And that's another topic, because he says Amar Nehira Shemo. His name would be Nehira, which also refers to light, because it says in Daniel 2:22, it says Un Hora Ima Sera in Aramaic. It says He knows what is in darkness, and light dwells within him. Even though it's Nehora, it's pronounced in Aramaic as Nehira. Okay? And it says, well, exactly right there. While it's read as Nehora, it's actually written as Nehira. Rav Yehuda ben Rav Simon said in the name of Rav Shmuel ben Rav Yitzchak about King Mashiach, if he's amongst the living, well, David is his name. However, if he's amongst the dead, David is still his name. Rav Tahuma said, I shall say the source, which is from Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, it is not written here, who magnifies the salvation of his king and does kindness to his anointed. So obviously anointed here refers to Mashiach and to David. It doesn't say conjunctive of and to David and his offspring forever. Rather, the verse says here that he does what? He does kindness to his anointed. That's what he does to David and his offspring forever. So in other words, not conjunctive, it's all condition. It's all culminated here is what the Midrash is saying. Now, another difference I want to point out between the Gemara Masechah Sanhedrin and the Midrash here in Echa is that when it speaks about Mashiach coming from the living and the dead, the Bavli mentions the names of Rav Yehuda Hanasi and also Daniel. And we'll read that over here. And so this comes right after Chazal called Mashiach a Metzora, a Chivra. And it continues there, and this time it says Amar Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman says that if Mashiach is among the Chaya from the living, then he's someone like me. As is stated in Jeremiah 30:21, and their princes shall be one of their own, and their rulers shall emerge from their midst. Rav said, if Mashiach is among the living, well, he's someone like Rabbeinu HaKadosh, which is Rav Yehuda Hanasi. If he's among the dead, then he's someone like Daniel, the greatly beloved. Okay, interesting. And then we have one more passage to quote here. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is destined to raise another David for them, as it's stated in Jeremiah 39. They will serve Hashem their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up for them. The verse does not say he raised in the past tense, which would connote the return of the original David HaMelech. Rather, it says I will raise, future tense, which connotes the rise of someone else. Rav Papa said to Abaye, but it's written in Ezekiel 37:25, my servant David will be a prince over them forever. V'David avdi Nasi lahem, over them leolam, forever, which indicates that the original David HaMelech, who will reign over the Jews in the future. And so it says the two Davids will be like a Kaiser, like Caesar, or a vice Caesar, like a half emperor, a viceroy. And it's a very interesting thing in there. I don't have a topic to get into right now for that, but we see how the Midrash and the Gemara, they have an approach to this, but they have alternative views regarding Mashiach or the two Davids being like Kaiser and a half Kaiser. I'm not going to get into that right now. That's another topic for another day. Okay, referring to the two Mashiachim, Mashiach ben Yosef ben David, but also you have Mashiach ben Aharon. There's a whole study in that by itself. So, with so much confusion surrounding the concept of Mashiach, why did Chazal preserve a teaching about the name of Mashiach, right? I mean, like, what's up with that? The name of Mashiach. And I can tell you, I've seen plenty of people run with these statements from Chazal and go and create all types of weird teachings off of them. Not 100% accurate. So what's up with this? Well, the Abarbanel, Rav Yitzchak Abarbanel, he explained that Chazal was not teaching about the actual name of Mashiach, because nobody knows that, but about the character of Mashiach, that it encompasses the virtues of man. And so the names of Mashiach were essentially fractals of each rabbi's name that possess a unique virtue of messianic consciousness. And this is brought down in his well-known book, Yeshuot Mashiach Who. I didn't get time to type the Hebrew out, but it's on page 47b for those that have access to it. He says that they spoke about Mashiach's name, not Mashiach himself, because they were not discussing Mashiach's actuality, but what the nation needed him to be. And intimated by name. Undoubtedly, each of the sages was seeking his unique virtue, which the Mashiach will have associate Mashiach's name with his name. So each Mashiach saw themselves as a spark, or each rabbi, saw themselves as a spark of Mashiach. That's what the Abarbanel is saying. And that's important when you want to understand the core of, I don't know what you call it, messianic theology, messianism, whatever you want to call it. And so this is the view of the original sages, which is why you'll never find a halakhic discourse in Masechet Sanhedrin about Mashiach, which is why you don't find it in Shulchan Aruch, but when you read about it in the Mishneh Torah from the Rambam, he deals with all of the passages involving Yerushalayim on these various topics, and so he attempts to codify what is the job of Mashiach, and he goes from Aleph, Beit, Gimel, etc. down to Tav. That if one is a candidate, this is what they have to do, right? Chazal never ruled on something because they weren't talking about the halakhic rulings of Mashiach. That's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about the functions of Mashiach, which is supposed to be a virtue that all of Israel is supposed to have. It's a state of consciousness. In fact, this concept here is found in the Tanakh, where we see Hashem, he called Koresh, or Cyrus, he called him his Mashiach, who is the king of Persia. Isaiah 45:1. Kol mar Hashem. Hashem, Elohim says, L'mishicho leKoresh, to Koresh, to Cyrus, my Messiah, my Mashiach, having grasped his right hand, treading down nations before him, ungirding the loins of kings, opening doors before him, and letting no gate stay shut. Koresh was instrumental in helping the Jewish people rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. He was called the Messiah. Not the Mashiach of Israel, but he is a Mashiach. And people have to understand this. This is what Chazal is doing over here. So when Chazal attempted to determine the Mashiach's name, the name that describes his personality, they concluded that it was the same as their own. Their yeshiva, the yeshiva of Rav Shela, Rav, Chanina, etc. And so there's really no dispute between Chazal about the Mashiach. And so when people go through these passages and they try to create theologies out of it, they have no clue what they're doing because they're taking everything out of context. Each rabbi was simply stressing the aspect of Mashiach's personality which he was most familiar with. So let's take a look at the names that were just mentioned. We're going to get to something fundamental here, which is supposed to be learning material. The name Shiloh is formed from two words. You have Shah, which is gift, and Lo, which means for him or to him. Now, the Midrash in Yachut Shimoni, I don't have on the screen, but it applies Shiloh from Genesis 49:10 with the verse over in Isaiah 18:7, in which it speaks of the nations bringing a gift to Israel and King Mashiach. This is when they're being restored from exile, and the nations are going to give them a gift. And so they yield this gift to Israel and to King Mashiach. So when you take a look at the blessing originally, contextually, that Yaakov placed upon Yehuda there in Genesis 49:10, it's essentially saying Mashiach will not fully arrive, or the messianic, the Yemot HaMashiach will not arrive until the nations of the world arrive at the same spiritual consciousness of Israel. That's what it's saying. That's what it's saying. There's a universal elevation in consciousness of man. This will not happen until that happens. Now, the next name is the name Yinon. This name is shrouded in great mystery. Earlier, when I quoted from Masechet Pesachim about the name of Mashiach predating creation of the world, the Gemara used Psalm 72:17 as a remez to the name of Mashiach. And we saw how the Gemara, Masechet Sanhedrin, and also the Midrash also alluded to Psalm 72:17 to speak about the name of Mashiach predating the world. So just to go back in context, we'll go back to Masechet Pesachim. And over here, once again, 7 things were created in the spiritual worlds before the creation, Shenifra Ha'olam, of the physical world, and they are Torah, Teshuvah, Gad Eden, Gehinom, V'chisei HaKavod, the throne of glory, Beit HaMikdash, Ushmo Shel Mashiach, and also the name of the Messiah. Eventually, The Gemara goes on to expound on each of these, but we're going to fast forward to Mashiach. And regarding over here, Shemo Shem Mashiach, excuse the extra sheen there, that was a typo on my behalf. It says diktiv, it's written, Yehi Shemo Le'olam, Lifnei Shemesh Yinon Shemo. It says here in Psalm 72:17, may his name endure forever. His name existed before the sun. I can't tell you how many things I've read and videos I've seen in which people use this passage or this rabbinical term, Yinon, to justify a pre-existing Messiah. Okay? Can't tell you how many. Many. And I can tell you right now that it's all inaccurate. Usually the word Yinon is translated as continued, as everlasting, or as enduring. But please listen to me. There is no direct English equivalent to the Hebrew word Yinon. Efes, klum, nada, nothing. There's zero equivalency. So anything you read or someone teaching, oh, this says enduring or pre-existing, it's not there. It's not in the Hebrew. People are reading into it. And so this has caused many people to misunderstand Chazal when it comes to the name of Mashiach being called Yinon. Let's get something straight contextually. What is Psalm 72 about? Well, Psalm 72 is about helping Hashem establish his divine will upon earth. According to Chazal, the age of Mashiach, or what's called Yemot HaMashiach, is about reaching a level of God consciousness, like what Adam HaRishon was at back in Gad Eden. And so if we read the entire verse that Chazal quotes from, we see it speaks of all of mankind praising Hashem. We'll go here to Psalm 72, verse 17. Yehi Shemo Le'olam Lifnei Shemesh Yinon Shemo. And may his name endure forever. May his name, I put Yinon, but I also left in bracket ionized. Why? What does that mean? Hang with me. I'm going to blow your mind in a minute. As long as the sun, okay? Therefore, may men be blessed. Vo in him. Kol goyim. It says, Ashruhu, may all nations call him happy, like the name Asher, okay? Very interesting. What does this mean now? So, I don't want to say translate, but I interpret the word Yinon as ionize, since the verse is speaking about the name of Hashem having a continuation like the sun. The meaning of the name Yinon as ionize is referring to something evaporating away. This is a messianic psalm that alludes to the moon, which is in Hebrew called lavana, which is waxing or waning away. And so Yinon as ionization alludes to lighting, and even the electrum that the prophet Yehezqel saw in the image of the man sitting on the throne in Ezekiel 126. Before the sun has ionized away, is before the end of the sun's life, where it becomes a planetary nova and finally a white dwarf. And when that happens, nothing in this orbit exists. Let's translate this spiritually or rabbinically. Rabbinically, Chazal understood Mashiach would be like a Sadiq who absorbs the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The light is ever emanating like the sun. And so the Mashiach, or the people in general, are likened to the moon, which receives the light when they are doing the will of Hashem. Because a moon doesn't have any light of its own, it receives it from the sun. However, chasas chalila, God forbid, if we are not doing the will of Hashem, then we are like the dark side of the moon. We are unable to receive the lights. Kabbalistically, this describes a relationship between Chachma and Malkut, the top of the sphirot to the bottom, where the wisdom of God, if we are righteous, flows down in from on high to this world, and it comes through the Sadiq or Sadiqim, through us. And so if we are not doing the will of Hashem, then guess what? Nobody receives that light. Why? Because we're steeped in materialism. And guess what this is called Kabbalistically? This is called Malchut Roma, the kingdom of Rome. It's called Edom, the klipa, the shell limitation of Esav. And guess what? Chazal says this is where Mashiach sits at, in the gate of Rome, which we'll get to at the end of this teaching. And so what we see here with the Shemesh, the sun, from Psalm 72. That's the light of God. Yinun is the receptacle of the light. And this is what we see here about the concept of the concept of Chachma and Malchut, Chen Nun. There's a flow flowing down. But if we don't, if we don't reflect the light, then we're in a fallen state. Okay, this is what this is alluding to. And so the name Yinun, by ionizing the sun, is an aspect of nothingness. Because if the sun's not there, then guess what? There's no photosynthesis, there's nothing. The entire solar system, or at least our planetary orbits, collapse. It's a state of nothingness. But spiritually, this is an interesting point because it's a state of bittul, negation, which is precisely how we receive the divine influx from Hashem. The most important thing to realize is that God created all and that He is all. God's influence never ceases. At every instant, He gives existence to all His creation, to all the universes, spiritual, immaterial, material realms, the heavenly chambers, the categories of angels, etc. In fact, in our morning prayers, in Yotzei Or, right before Shema, we say, Hashem Yotzei Or uvarei choshech, which is taken from Isaiah. He forms light and creates darkness. But guess what? That phrase is in the present tense. We don't say He formed the light and created darkness in the past tense. We say God creates in the present tense because every second He creates and gives existence to all that is. Everything. Everything comes from Hashem. He is perfect and He includes all things. So when a person attains the attribute of nothingness, a bittul, he realizes that he is nothing and that God is giving him existence. And that means he can then say God creates. Everything is through Him at the present moment. However, the downside is when a person looks at himself not as nothingness but as somethingness, as yesh, he becomes an independent existence. And he's steeped in the lower vibrational frequency of reality, which he's not connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so what we see here, on the level of nothingness, when a person says, I'm nothing, not that they should enter a state of depression, a yiush, I'm nothing, I'm a failure. No, they realize that they are nothing. There's nothing. There's no pride, there's no ego. When the ego is absent, this is powerful. When the ego is absent on a level of nothingness, everything is above the laws of nature. On a level of somethingness, all things are bound by nature. That's why when a person has to tap into this world and they want to compete and be successful on the vibrational frequency of this world, they're bound by nature. You're going to have to deal with the natural elements and the order of the world if your ego is in there. But if your ego is absent, then guess what? You're outside of nature. And so the only way you combine somethingness and nothingness is, guess what? Through Torah and mitzvot. That's when you negate yourself, deplete the ego, and you connect yourself to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the whole divine light, the influx to pass down. And so Yinun for Mashiach is referring to a conscious state of removing the ego. That is what the glimpses of the messianic era, Yemot HaMashiach, is no longer the ego, the Yetzer Hara taking over. That's what that refers to. So the Chazal in their genius, if you will, understood as if the sun became a white dwarf. Nothing exists. That's the ideal state of Mashiach or messianic consciousness. That's what man is supposed to attain. Has nothing to do about a pre-existing Messiah. Nothing. Identifying the Mashiach with the name Chivra, which is Metzora in Hebrew, is a remez to the sufferings of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, a Masachet Bava Matzia. Chazal mentioned how Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, he had endured many agonizing diseases for various years. And so this rabbinic interpretation supports the idea of the suffering of the righteous, that when the righteous suffer, they can mitigate the wrath of Hashem. And what's important about this rabbinic concept of Mashiach is that Chazal is not implying that the Mashiach per se is to be afflicted with what's called sara'at, which is the skin disease, a person becomes a Metzora. Rather, Mashiach is allegorically described in this way because sara'at involves the decay of a person. The decay of a person will eventually lead to the restoration, which is why when you became a Metzora, you had to go outside the camp of Israel. The Kohen would come to you to determine if you did Shuvah. So there had to be a breakdown of your body, of your possessions, of your finances. And then you went into a galut, an exile. Now, what's interesting about this is that the Gemara's identification of Mashiach as a Metzora happens to correspond to Midrash that mention the name of Mashiach as Semach and Menachem. How does the Metzora correspond to Semach and Menachem? Through the process of decay. How is that? Pay attention to this. Going back to the Midrash. It says over here, Rabbi Yehush, in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, Amar Semach Shemo. Mashiach's name would be Semach, because it says in Isaiah, or not Isaiah, Zechariah 6:12. Hinei ish Semach Shemo. His name would be Semach. He shall flourish in his place because he's going to build a sanctuary of God. What happens to the sanctuary of God? It's destroyed. Okay? Keep that in mind. Destroyed. So it has to sprout from a place of destruction. Rav Yudin said in the name of Rav Ivu, his name is Menachem. Why? Because it says, regarding that destruction that took place in Echa 1:6, Ki rachak mimi, many, tongue twisted, a comforter to restore my soul is far from me. Rav Chanina says, Rega, listen, don't argue, Semach, Menachem. It's all semantics because they have the same numerical value. Semach is 138, Menachem is 138. Okay. So, according to the Midrash, the name of Semach and Menachem have the same value, numerical value. What does this reveal, and how is it related to the Gemara Chol Mashiach Metzora? Listen closely. Perfection in this world requires that there originally existed something imperfect that was then perfected. The world was created in a way that all existence comes from non-existence. In Masechet Truma, the sages taught that in the case of a kosher bird that became what's called trefa, it developed some type of sickness or defect, it mentioned its chick would be permitted and not forbidden. So it's mutar and it's not basically forbidden for them as something, and it's permitted for something that developed from trefa. Which logic would think if the bird is kosher, becomes trefa, then the chick should be trefa. Chazal says no. The chick is permitted. Why is that? This is because the chick can develop from the egg. The matter inside the egg must decay. And at that point, its forbidden status is then removed. And so the germination of new life comes from the decay that preceded it. Likewise, all seeds that are planted in the ground first disintegrate and decay, and only afterward begin to grow into new plants. This process in Hebrew is actually called semicha, literally sprouting, which is where the name Semach comes from. And this same principle applies spiritually. Sprouting must emanate from decay. Chazal taught that that the one who mourns over the loss of the destruction of Yerushalayim will merit to see its consolation. That's in Masechet Ta'anit, Masechet Bava Batra. The rebuilding of Yerushalayim and the rebirth of Israel's freedom can come about only after there existed a state of destruction. This is the process of semicha, which is why Mashiach is called Semach. And it's not just an individual, it's to the people. It's a state of consciousness. The people reached a low level, it brought on the destruction. It brought on suffering and persecution. It's a process. So when Chazal teach that Mashiach was born on Tisha B'Av, they're not saying that the Mashiach himself was born on Tisha B'Av. No, they're saying the revelation of Mashiach was born on Tisha B'Av. Out of destruction comes a revelation of redemption. It's a message to the people. The people needed to go through a process, a semicha, a sprouting. So by calling Mashiach Menachem, Chazal was implying that once redemption has sprouted from destruction, the people will be comforted for the years of pain and suffering. The people will look back and understand the years that they suffered were a part of the process of decay that caused the brilliant light of Yemot HaMashiach to shine, to reach this new era. This is true consolation. That's why we correspond to Midrash of the Gemara. A mitzvah is someone, once they go into exile, they realize the mistake they made. Motzi ra, they brought forth evil. They do a shuva shlema, the Kohen Hagadol sees it, they go through the purification, they come back into the camp of Israel. Now in this week's Torah portion, Moshe said, Re'eh Anochi, look at me. in which he was telling the people to closely look at his life, to see how his life was a perfect example for the blessing of the Torah. That means if the people wanted to experience the blessing, they needed to learn from the life of Moshe. And it is without coincidence that the name Shiloh, that the rabbis say is one of the name of Mashiach, has the same numerical value of the name Moshe, which is 345. So Moshe is a Mashiach. Like Moshe, each of Chazal taught how their personality was a fractal spark of messianic consciousness. And it's without any coincidence that the name Mashiach, Mem Shin Yun Chet, is also an acronym. For who? Menachem, Shiloh, Yinon, and Chanina. For the so-called names of Messiah in the Gemara. And as the Abarbanel taught, the Mashiach will have all the virtues signified by these names. Because it's not just the individual, it's the collective consciousness of the people. This is also why the Or HaChaim says the name of Mashiach was Chaim. Not that Mashiach's name in the individual is Chaim, but the personality of the Or HaChaim was a fractal spark of messianic consciousness. Going back to the Or HaChaim's comment in Deuteronomy 15:7. Therefore the verse concludes by saying, against your destitute brother, which may be interpreted mean on account of your brother, the Ha'evyon, which is the well-known destitute one, Melech Mashiach. This means that a person shall consider in his mind that the good deed that he performs is for the purpose of this matter, to hasten the arrival of the anointed one of Hashem, Mashiach Hashem Shemo Chaim, whose name is Chaim, whose name is life. The Or HaChaim said the redemption will come through the mitzvah of Sadaka, which once again is an extension of Maser Oni, giving to the poor, right? We'll go back to the Or HaChaim on that passage. By saying we shall not harden our heart or close our hand, Hashem is instructing every Jew not to harden their heart against Mashiach. Remember, Mashiach is not just an individual. It's a state of consciousness, people. They shall strengthen themselves with all the might and power that they possess to do everything they can to fulfill longing of the one and only Mashiach. For Mashiach's arrival will occur only by means of good deeds performed by people, and particularly through the mitzvah Sadaka, as is written in regards to Yerushalayim, Isaiah 45 or 54:14, that you shall be established by Sadaka, in Sadaka. All right, Sadaka is based on giving. Giving. I mentioned earlier, regarding the Mashiach being called the name Yinon, that if the people are not reflecting the light of Hashem, they're not going to receive the light since they are trapped in a lower consciousness of materialism. This state of mind is called the kingdom of Rome, Malchut Roma, the klipa of Esav, in which Mashiach sits at the gate. And Masechet Sanhedrin, we have the well-known story of Rabbi Yehoshua going to King Mashiach to inquire about when the redemption would take place. And there the Gemara describes Mashiach sitting with the poor at the gate of Rome. Go here to the Gemara, Sanhedrin 98b. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, he met here with Eliyahu Hanavi, who was standing at the entrance of the cave of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked Eliyahu, hey, will I enter Olam Haba? Eliyahu answered him, if this master desires it, referring to the Shekhinah. Then goes on to say, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi then said, I saw two people, but I heard the voice of three. When will Mashiach come? Eliyahu answered him, go and ask him yourself. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi then asks, where is he sitting? Eliyahu says, at the gate of Rome. The gate, Sha'arecha, one of your gates, it says, for the Evyon, the destitute. Remember that. The gate is a state of consciousness, a portal to the mind. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asks, what is his distinguishing feature? Eliyahu answered him, he's sitting among who? He's sitting among the poor, the onei, the poor, who are afflicted with disease. All of them untie all their bandages. So it's describing sara'at, being a mitzorah, being in exile. They do this at the same time with their bandages, but he unties and ties his bandages one by one. For he says, I might be needed at any moment, therefore I'll deal with my bandages in this way that I will not be delayed. It goes on to conclude, Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi then went to Mashiach and he said to him afterwards, Shalom Alecha, peace be upon you, my master, right? And afterwards, the Mashiach then responds to him, Shalom Alecha Bar Levi, son of Levi, peace be upon you. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asks him, hey, when's the master coming? Mashiach responded, good news, Hayom, today, I'm coming today. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi then went back to Eliyahu. Eliyahu asked him, what did he say to you? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, he said, peace be upon you, ben Levi. Eliyahu says, he assured you and your father you were both destined to enter Olam Haba. Remember, this was the first question Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi asked Eliyahu if he was Zoche for Olam Haba, and which he gets the answer. But Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi then says to Eliyahu, however, Mashiach lied to me. He said he was coming today, and he has not come. He's not here. Velo ata. Where is he? Eliyahu then responds to him, this is what he meant when he said to you, Hayom, quoting from Psalm. The book of Psalms says over here in chapter 95:7, Hayom, im, today only im, bekolo, tishme'u, only if you listen to his, Hashem's voice. Only if you listen to the voice of Hashem can it happen today. In other words, redemption can only take place if the people are truly willing to rectify their damage. God can expedite it and end exile. And that comes with elevating the mind, the consciousness out of the materialistic state of Edom, of the klipa, which is a restraining shell, is what that alludes to. And so the reason why I called this teaching Mashiach Who is because who is Mashiach, right? Everybody and their mother has an answer, or who they think of Mashiach, or who will be Mashiach, or who was Mashiach. And it's all based on these Maimar Chazal, and they don't know anything about these words of the sages. Because people take one, they run with this, they run with that. So what we learn here on the level of application is we are introduced to the mitzvah of tithing. Tithing plays a significant part in Jewish life. Yes, when the Beit HaMikdash was there, we brought tithes a certain way, but we don't have that system right now. And so we have from the Maaser Kasafim or Sadaka, we tithe through our money, whether we give through the actual poor, maybe it's a charitable organization, a yeshiva, or a project of some sort, whatever it is, we do that. And when we do that, we get a guarantee that Hashem will bless us in return. But when we do that, what are we doing? We're strengthening not just our observance of mitzvot, but we're elevating our consciousness. Because what Moshe is saying, Re'eh Anochi, look at me. I lead the path for you to follow. Each of the sages corresponding to the name of Mashiach represented a specific personality trait that represents messianic consciousness. That the Mashiach embodies all of these ideas, is what it's saying as a Superman figure, but it's not just limited to an individual. It's a state of consciousness that's supposed to be shared with the people. And so, Maser Oni, the tithe to the poor, Sadaka, is that many people are poor. Not just physically without physical kesef, but they're poor in soul, they're poor in their emotions. And so when we go out to try to reach them, help them be rectified, that's a form of Sadaka. And so with that said, Chavarim, that's going to bring me to an end of the teaching here for Parashat Re'eh, which means see, look, observe. And one of the things I would like to say that I think is really fascinating from this when we break down the words of Chazal is about semach and semicha, process of sprouting, is that really sprouting comes through a process of destruction, right? And the world, for that matter, is going through a whole process right now. But you have to figure out where you're at in that process. Don't be steeped in this materialism. Don't be stuck at the gate of Rome, which is a state of mind. It's a klipa that's hindering your growth and development. Learn to give and continue to expand. So when you give with the attention on giving, let's say Sadaka, right? That is done with an energy that's building, expanding a state of consciousness. And who do you learn it from? You look at Moshe or others like Moshe to emulate them and watch Hashem bless you abundantly. Not just in physical things, but spiritual things as well, because that's ultimately the tachlit or the goal. And so with that said, Chavarim, that brings us to a close here for our teaching on Parashat Re'eh. Once again, if our organization is a blessing to you and you would like to give Sadaka, like to donate, feel free to do so. You can find a link directly on the page. And I want to say here in closing that I haven't had any videos uploaded, and that's because I've been preoccupied. Once again, these teachings are made available based upon the donations. Because as the sages say in Parashat Re'eh, ein kamach, ein Torah, ein kamach. No flour, no Torah, no Torah, no flour. Because the Torah teaches us how to create the formula for parnosa, residue, the formula for the actual parnosa, which is the format. And so when a person, is not giving the support all the way, they can't always dedicate their time, right? I know everyone's going through certain things, but I have other projects I get involved with, and so I haven't been available lately, so I do apologize for that in advance, but we do appreciate your support, and please, if you have questions pertaining to the teachings, feel free to send me an email, and I will answer those in the order they come in. So until next time, Chavarim, may the God of Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov bless you and your family. Shalom and Kol Tuv.